So you can see in this slide, I've tried to summarize two main tracks that are associated, let's say, with a geothermal installation. So there's obviously the construction phase, which is the one that everybody thinks about when there are drilling processes and drilling machines on site, or the installation of geothermal heat exchangers and how those are completed. They might be groundwater boreholes, or indeed how plant rooms are constructed and equipment installed or buildings retrofitted. So they're generally the immediate and most visual items that everyone can think about. But in terms of environmental impact assessment, one also has to consider the operational phase. So after the construction, when the system is in operation, you have to consider, for example, the CO2 emissions, which are generally resulting in a saving if they're displacing fossil fuel fired systems. They need to consider the impact on ground temperatures over long periods of time, the aquifer properties, or indeed the status of the building and the building comfort. And in the table on the bottom, you can see some, not all, but some of the common topics that are covered in any environmental impact assessment. This means that in any type of project where you are aware that there is an environmental impact assessment being carried out, the topics that you see in the table are addressed individually in each section of the environmental impact assessment. So these topics provide a really good structure to understand and develop strategies for sustainably completing and operating geothermal systems. So you might recall I mentioned earlier, this impact assessment methodology is generally done on a risk assessment based approach. And you can see here in the flow chart, in the top of the flow chart, there are the three overarching, let's say, areas. So first of all, you've got to define the baseline conditions. So you've got to define the receiving environment in every single one of the topics that you saw in the previous slide in terms of what the conditions are prior to designing or completing or operating the project. Then you've got to outline your proposed development and try in a semi-qualitative way to define what the impacts might be of your project on the receiving environment. And as part of that, you might have to carry out some site-specific measurements to define any specific conditions, and we will show you some examples of those later on. They might be noise and vibration surveys, or they might indeed be pumping tests or thermal response tests, like you will have heard of in different submodules. And based on the results of those site-specific measurements, you can then define some mitigating measures. So they are the measures that, as a designer or as a constructor of the system, you will put in place in order to minimize any long-term impacts of your project and therefore to the receptors that we discussed earlier on.